Sometimes the most important person in a room is the one everyone is trying to throw out. The words would have sounded unbelievable to anyone standing inside the National Military Heritage Center that quiet Saturday morning. Sunlight filtered through the massive glass walls, casting long bands of gold across polished floors and display cases worth millions of dollars. The soft hum of climate control systems blended with distant conversations as visitors moved from exhibit to exhibit, admiring fragments of history preserved behind spotless glass. Children pointed at faded uniforms. Veterans paused before photographs from wars long past. Tourists lifted phones to capture memories. Everything felt orderly. Everything felt important. And yet almost nobody noticed the old man standing alone near the center gallery. Thomas Whitaker looked like someone who had wandered in by mistake. At 86 years old, his shoulders carried the gentle curve of age. His brown jacket was worn smooth at the elbows. His gray hair was thin beneath a weathered baseball cap. Nothing about him attracted attention. Nothing about him suggested significance. He simply stood there in silence while streams of visitors passed around him like water flowing around a stone. But Thomas wasn't looking at the exhibits the way everyone else was. He wasn't reading placards. He wasn't taking pictures. He wasn't following the guided tour. His pale blue eyes remained fixed on a single display case at the far end of the gallery. A battlefield journal. The artifact sat beneath carefully positioned lights, surrounded by informational panels explaining its historical significance. Visitors glanced at it for a few seconds before moving on. Thomas hadn't moved for nearly 10 minutes. From across the room, security supervisor Ethan Brooks noticed him. Ethan was 28 years old, sharp-dressed, ambitious, and proud of the responsibility attached to his position. Museums attracted all kinds of visitors. Most were harmless. Some were not. His job was to spot problems before they happened. And from where he stood, the old man lingering beside one display for so long looked suspicious. Ethan adjusted the radio clip to his belt and started walking. His polished shoes tapped softly against the floor. A few visitors stepped aside as he approached. Thomas never looked up. He continued staring through the glass as though the rest of the museum had disappeared. Ethan stopped beside him. "Sir," he said politely but firmly. No response. "Sir." Thomas blinked slowly. His gaze finally shifted toward the younger man. "Can I help you?" Ethan asked. Thomas looked back at the journal. "Just looking." His voice was quiet, gravelly with age. Ethan followed his line of sight. "You've been standing here a while." "Have I?" "Nearly 10 minutes." Thomas gave a small nod. "Doesn't feel that long." Something about the answer irritated Ethan more than it should have. The old man wasn't breaking rules. He wasn't causing a disturbance. Yet there was an unsettling calm about him, a confidence that didn't fit the situation. Ethan folded his arms. "This exhibit is one of our most valuable collections. I'm going to ask that you keep moving with the rest of the visitors." For the first time, a faint expression crossed Thomas's face. Not anger, not embarrassment, something closer to sadness. His eyes returned to the journal behind the glass. Then he quietly said 6 words that would change everything. "I haven't seen it in years." The words lingered in the air long after Thomas Whitaker spoke them. "I have not seen it in years." Ethan Brooks stared at him, uncertain whether to be annoyed or confused. Around them, the museum continued its quiet rhythm. Visitors drifted between exhibits. Soft footsteps echoed across polished floors. Somewhere in the distance, a guide was explaining the significance of a restored World War II field radio. But for a moment, Ethan found himself looking at the old man differently. Not because of what he had said, but because of how he had said it. There had been no hesitation, no uncertainty, just a calm certainty that seemed completely out of place. Ethan glanced toward the journal behind the glass. The artifact was one of the museum's most celebrated pieces. School groups visited specifically to see it. Historians referenced it in lectures and documentaries. Thousands of people had viewed it over the years. Yet the way Thomas had spoken made it sound less like a museum exhibit and more like an old photograph stored in a family attic. "You have seen it before?" Ethan asked. Thomas nodded once. "A long time ago." "How long?" The old man studied the display. "Long enough for most people to forget." Ethan let out a quiet breath. That answer did not help. If anything, it made the situation more irritating. Security training had taught him that unusual behavior often came wrapped in vague explanations. "Sir," If you are a donor or part of a tour group, I can verify that. Thomas slowly shook his head. No. Then I really need you to keep moving. The old man remained still. Not stubborn. Not confrontational. Simply unmoved. Visitors were beginning to notice the exchange. A family paused nearby. Two college students slowed their pace. Nothing attracted attention faster than a uniformed employee speaking firmly to an elderly visitor. Ethan could feel eyes turning toward them. The last thing he wanted was a scene. Before he could say anything else, Thomas took a small step closer to the display case. His reflection appeared in the glass beside the journal. For several seconds, he simply looked at it. The faded pages rested beneath carefully controlled lighting. The brown leather cover showed every year of its age. A small brass plaque beneath it described the artifact's historical significance. Most visitors spent less than 30 seconds reading it. Thomas seemed unable to look away. There was something almost haunting in his expression now. A quiet weight that had not been there before. Ethan followed his gaze again. He had seen the journal hundreds of times. It was just another exhibit to him. Another item on a floor plan he patrolled every day. But Thomas looked at it, as if it contained something far more important than words on paper. Then something unexpected happened. The old man reached into the inside pocket of his jacket. Slowly, carefully, he pulled out a folded piece of yellowed paper. The edges were worn from age. The creases looked decades old. Thomas stared at it for a moment before unfolding it with hands that moved deliberately despite their age. Ethan immediately straightened. "Sir." Thomas did not respond. His attention remained fixed on the paper. Nearby visitors noticed. Conversations softened. Curiosity spread through the gallery. Whatever was happening, people could feel it. Thomas carefully lowered the document beside the display case. And across the room, a young archivist named Emily Carter happened to look up at exactly the wrong moment for history to remain buried. Emily Carter had been cataloging acquisition records at a workstation nearly 30 feet away when something caught her eye. At first, it was not the old man. It was not the security supervisor. It was the paper. Years of working with historical documents had trained her eyes to notice details other people ignored. The color of aged paper. The shape of folded corners. The way ink faded over decades. She looked up from her screen and saw the yellowed document resting beside the display case. Something about it felt wrong. Or perhaps too right. Emily stood slowly. Around her, visitors continued moving through the gallery, unaware that anything unusual was happening. But she could not shake the feeling tugging at the back of her mind. She stepped away from her desk and walked toward the exhibit. Ethan immediately noticed her approach. "Everything is fine," he said before she could ask a question. "Just handling a visitor issue." Emily barely heard him. Her attention remained fixed on the document. Thomas Whitaker stood quietly beside the display, his weathered hands resting at his sides. He looked calm, far calmer than someone being questioned by security should have looked. Emily moved closer. The overhead lights reflected softly across the glass case. The battlefield journal sat exactly where it always had. But now there was something beside it. Something that absolutely should not have been there. "May I see that?" she asked quietly. Thomas looked at her for a moment. Then he nodded. Emily lowered her gaze toward the paper. The first thing she noticed was the handwriting. The second thing made her heart skip. Her eyes moved back and forth between the document and the journal behind the glass. Once, twice, 3 times. Suddenly the sounds of the museum seemed to fade away. The distant conversations. The footsteps. The air system humming overhead. Everything became background noise. Ethan frowned. "What is it?" Emily did not answer immediately. She leaned closer. Her breathing slowed. Every line, every stroke, every curve of the handwriting matched perfectly. The signature at the bottom of the paper was identical to the signature preserved inside the journal. Not similar. Not close. Identical. A chill moved through her. That should have been impossible. For decades, historians had studied that journal. Experts had authenticated every page. Countless articles had been written about it. Yet there was one mystery nobody had ever solved. One missing piece that appeared in every report. A final document referenced repeatedly, but never found. Emily knew the story because she had helped organize the exhibit herself. She looked up at Thomas. "Where did you get this?" Her voice was barely above a whisper. The old man's expression did not change. "I kept it." Emily felt her pulse quicken. Ethan crossed his arms. "Kept what?" She ignored him. Her eyes remained locked on Thomas. You kept this all these years? Thomas nodded once. I was supposed to. The answer only deepened the mystery. Nearby visitors had begun slowing down. Curiosity spread through the gallery. People sensed something important was happening, even if they did not know what. Ethan shifted uncomfortably. He no longer felt in control of the situation. Emily carefully looked at the paper again. Then she made a decision. Without another word, she reached for her phone. Her fingers moved quickly across the screen. Ethan watched her. Who are you calling? Emily never looked away from the document. The one person in this building who needs to see this immediately. The call lasted less than 20 seconds. Emily Carter spoke quietly, listened carefully, then ended the connection without explaining anything. The moment she lowered her phone, Ethan Brooks stepped forward. Emily, what exactly is happening? His voice carried a mixture of irritation and concern. The situation had drifted far beyond what he expected when he first approached the old man. Visitors had begun gathering around the exhibit. Nothing dramatic had happened, yet people could sense something unusual unfolding. Human curiosity had a way of pulling crowds toward mystery. Emily slipped her phone into her pocket and looked at the document again. Dr. Holloway is coming. Ethan frowned. The chief curator? She nodded. Immediately. That answer only deepened his confusion. Dr. Richard Holloway rarely left executive meetings for routine matters. He certainly did not rush across the museum because of a visitor carrying an old piece of paper. Ethan glanced at Thomas Whitaker. The elderly man remained calm, almost detached from the growing attention surrounding him. His eyes stayed fixed on the journal inside the display case. Not once had he attempted to explain himself. Not once had he argued. The stillness was beginning to unsettle Ethan. Across the gallery, conversations had softened into whispers. Several visitors pretended to study nearby exhibits while secretly watching the scene unfold. The soft lighting reflected across polished glass surfaces. The air felt strangely heavier than before. Emily carefully picked up the document, holding it by the edges. Every instinct she possessed as an archivist told her this paper was genuine. The aging pattern was consistent. The ink appeared authentic. Even the fold lines suggested decades of careful storage. Yet none of that was what truly bothered her. What bothered her was the signature. She had spent years studying documents connected to the exhibit. The handwriting was as familiar to her as her own. Countless nights had been spent reviewing scans, records, and acquisition reports. She knew every detail historians had uncovered, and she knew every detail they never had. One question had remained unanswered for over 40 years. What happened to the missing correspondence mentioned throughout the journal? The document in her hands appeared to answer that question. Emily slowly looked toward Thomas. You knew what this was. It was not really a question. Thomas nodded. Of course. Then why bring it here now? For the first time, the old man seemed to consider his answer. His gaze drifted toward the journal. The reflection of the display lights shimmered across the glass between them. Because I wanted to see if anyone still remembered. The words landed softly. Yet something about them sent a chill through Emily. Before she could respond, movement near the gallery entrance caught everyone's attention. A tall man in a dark gray suit appeared at the far end of the room. His pace was quick, purposeful. Museum employees immediately stepped aside. Visitors instinctively moved out of his path. Dr. Richard Holloway rarely hurried anywhere. Today, he practically crossed the floor at a fast walk. His silver hair was slightly disheveled, as though he had left a meeting without stopping to gather himself. He reached the exhibit and looked first at Emily, then at the document she held. Show me. His voice was calm, but there was urgency beneath it. Emily handed him the paper. The curator lowered his eyes. The gallery became completely silent, and within seconds, the expression on his face changed in a way that made everyone nearby stop breathing. Dr. Richard Holloway did not speak. That was the first thing everyone noticed. The chief curator was a man known for lectures, presentations, and interviews. He always had something to say. Yet now he simply stood there beneath the museum lights, holding the aged document with both hands. His eyes moved slowly across the page. Once, then again, the silence stretched. Visitors exchanged uncertain glances. Even the distant sounds of the museum seemed to fade into the background. Ethan Brooks felt a knot forming in his stomach. Whatever he had expected, it was not this. He looked toward Emily Carter, hoping for some explanation. Instead, He found her watching the curator with the same tense anticipation as everyone else. Holloway lowered the paper slightly and looked through the glass at the battlefield journal. His reflection stared back at him from the display case. Then he returned his attention to the document. The muscles in his jaw tightened. "Doctor?" Emily finally asked. Holloway did not answer immediately. His gaze drifted toward Thomas Whitaker. The old man remained exactly where he had been standing. Calm, patient, as though he had expected every second of this. The curator took a slow breath. "How long?" he asked quietly. Thomas understood the question immediately. 43 years. The answer hit Holloway harder than anyone expected. For a brief moment, genuine emotion crossed his face. Not surprise, not excitement, something closer to disbelief. 43 years, he repeated. Nearby visitors were openly listening now. Nobody pretended otherwise. Curiosity had completely taken over. Ethan shifted his weight uncomfortably. He still had no idea what was happening, but he could feel control slipping farther away with every passing second. Holloway carefully turned the document over. His eyes widened slightly. There it was. Another notation. Another handwritten entry. One that should not have existed. One historians had searched for across archives, collections, and private estates for decades. Emily noticed the change immediately. "What is it?" The curator looked at her. "Do you know what this means?" Emily swallowed. "I think so." Holloway shook his head slowly. "No, I do not think you do." His voice remained soft, but every word carried weight. He looked back at the paper. "This is not just a missing document." The crowd grew even quieter. "This is the missing document." A ripple of confusion moved through the visitors. Most had no idea what that distinction meant. Emily did. Ethan did not. Thomas simply listened. Holloway stepped closer to the display case. The journal rested under glass exactly as it had every day for years. Yet suddenly it looked incomplete. Incomplete because the missing piece of its story was no longer missing. The curator's eyes returned to Thomas. "We spent decades trying to identify who received this correspondence." Thomas said nothing. "We reviewed military records, archive collections, family estates, university holdings. We followed every lead we could find." Holloway paused. And all this time, his voice trailed away. The old man offered a faint smile. Not proud, not triumphant, just tired. The kind of smile carried by someone who had spent a lifetime watching history move on without him. Then Holloway asked the question nobody else in the room had thought to ask. "Why did you never come forward?" For the first time since entering the museum, Thomas looked away from the journal. His eyes drifted toward a photograph hanging beside the exhibit, a black and white image frozen in time. When he finally answered, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Because it was never supposed to be about me." Thomas Whitaker's words settled over the gallery like dust drifting through sunlight. "Because it was never supposed to be about me." Nobody responded immediately. The visitors standing nearby remained silent. Emily Carter lowered her eyes toward the document. Dr. Richard Holloway continued studying the old man as though he were seeing a ghost standing in plain sight. Even Ethan Brooks had stopped trying to control the situation. For the first time since approaching Thomas, he felt less like a security supervisor and more like an outsider looking through a window at a story he did not understand. Thomas turned his attention back toward the black and white photograph hanging beside the exhibit. The image showed a small group of young servicemen standing together decades earlier. Time had faded the picture slightly. The corners showed signs of age. Yet the expressions remained clear. Young faces. Determined faces. Faces belonging to people who believed the future stretched endlessly before them. Thomas stared at the photograph for several seconds. Then the museum disappeared. The soft lights vanished. The polished floors vanished. The murmur of visitors faded into silence. In his mind, he was standing somewhere entirely different. The air felt warmer. A gentle wind moved through tall grass. The smell of damp earth lingered beneath a wide, open sky. He was 23 years old again. The photograph had been taken only hours after a mission that none of them expected historians would ever remember. There had been no speeches, no cameras, no reporters, just a handful of exhausted young men sitting together at the end of a very long day. Someone had found a camera. Someone else had suggested taking a picture. Most of them had laughed. A few had complained, but they gathered together anyway. The photograph lasted less than a second. The memory lasted a lifetime. Thomas remembered the journal as clearly as if it were resting in his hands now. It had belonged to a friend, a man who recorded everything. Names, dates, observations, thoughts, small moments that seemed unimportant at the time. The kind of details history usually forgets. On the final evening before they went their separate ways, that friend had sat beneath a dim light and written one last entry. Then he carefully removed a single page. He folded it, signed it, and handed it to Thomas. "Keep this." Thomas could still hear the voice after all these years. "Why me?" he had asked. The answer had come with a smile. "Because you understand the difference between remembering and being remembered." Back in the present, Thomas blinked slowly. The memory dissolved. The museum returned around him. The glass displays, the visitors, the lights overhead. Emily noticed the distant look in his eyes. "You knew the author personally?" It was not a question. Thomas nodded. Holloway's expression shifted again. Historians had debated the author's identity for decades. Entire articles had been written, theories proposed, records analyzed. Yet now the answer seemed to be standing quietly in front of them, wearing a worn brown jacket. "You were there," the curator said softly. Thomas looked toward the journal one more time. "Yes." Holloway drew a slow breath. "Then everything we thought we knew about this exhibit may be incomplete." The old man remained silent, but his eyes drifted back to the photograph, to the faces frozen in time. And for the first time, Emily noticed something she had missed before. One of the young men standing near the center looked remarkably familiar. Emily Carter stepped closer to the photograph, her eyes narrowing as she studied the faded faces trapped behind glass. For years she had walked past that image without giving it more than a few seconds of attention. Like countless visitors, she had focused on the larger story surrounding the exhibit. The journal, the missing correspondence, the historical mystery. But now she found herself looking at something entirely different. A face. One particular face standing near the center of the photograph. Young, lean, barely more than a man. The resemblance was impossible to ignore once she saw it. Her pulse quickened. She glanced toward Thomas Whitaker, then back toward the image. Again and again. The similarities became clearer each time. The shape of the jaw, the eyes, even the faint expression seemed familiar. "Dr. Holloway," she said quietly. The curator followed her gaze. At first, he did not understand what she was seeing. Then his eyes settled on the same figure. His expression froze. Several seconds passed. Neither spoke. Ethan Brooks watched the exchange with growing unease. "What is it now?" he asked. Emily slowly raised a hand toward the photograph. "That man." Holloway took a step closer to the display. The overhead lights reflected softly across the protective glass. The image had been enlarged from an original print discovered decades earlier. Historians knew the names of most people in the photograph. Most, not all. One figure had never been positively identified. Records simply listed him as unknown. The mystery had remained unsolved for more than 4 decades. Holloway looked from the photograph to Thomas, then back again. A realization began forming behind his eyes. The old man remained silent. He did not appear surprised. If anything, he looked tired, as though he had carried this moment for years. "No," Ethan said, shaking his head. "There is no way." Emily could not look away from the image. "I think there is." Visitors had drawn even closer now. A small crowd surrounded the exhibit. Nobody spoke above a whisper. Everyone sensed they were witnessing something extraordinary. Holloway carefully removed a tablet from his jacket pocket and opened the museum archive database. His fingers moved quickly across the screen. Decades of records appeared. Scanned photographs, acquisition notes, research files, historical correspondence. He located the original photograph and enlarged it. The younger man's face filled the screen. Holloway compared it to Thomas. The years had changed him, of course. Tom always did. But some things remained untouched. The eyes, the posture, the quiet steadiness. "My God," Holloway whispered. Ethan stared at him. "What?" The curator lowered the tablet slowly. The unidentified figure. Emily already knew the answer before he spoke it aloud. "You found him." Holloway nodded. Then he looked directly at Thomas Whitaker. No, his voice carried a quiet reverence now. "He found us." The words settled heavily over the gallery. For years the museum had told a story with a missing chapter. Historians had built theories around incomplete information. Researchers had searched archives across the country. Yet the answer had never been hidden in a government vault or private collection. It had simply gone home. Thomas looked once more at the photograph. His younger self stared back across 43 years of history. The crowd remained silent. Then Holloway asked a question nobody expected. Do you know what was written on the missing page before it was signed? For the first time all afternoon, Thomas smiled. And that smile made it clear the biggest revelation had not happened yet. Thomas Whitaker's smile was small, almost invisible, but it changed the atmosphere inside the gallery. It was the smile of a man who had spent decades carrying a memory that belonged to more people than himself. Around him, the crowd waited. Emily Carter waited. Ethan Brooks waited. Even Dr. Richard Holloway seemed unwilling to breathe too loudly. The question still hung in the air. Did he know what had been written on the missing page before it was signed? Thomas looked toward the document resting carefully in the curator's hands. The paper appeared fragile beneath the bright museum lights. 43 years of history folded into a few inches of aging parchment. I remember every word, he said quietly. The response sent a visible reaction through the curator. Holloway stared at him for several seconds. Every word. Thomas nodded. Some things stay with you. The gallery remained silent. Visitors stood shoulder to shoulder now. Nobody wanted to leave. Nobody wanted to miss what came next. Holloway glanced down at the document again. Then tell me. Thomas looked toward the photograph one final time. The younger faces stared back from another era. For a moment, his expression softened. It was not a report. Emily frowned slightly. Historians had always assumed the missing page contained operational details. Timelines. Observations. Information that would complete the historical record. It was not, she asked. Thomas shook his head. No, the old man looked around the room. That is why nobody could understand why it disappeared. Holloway slowly lowered the paper. Then what was it? Thomas took a breath. The answer came softly. A letter. The word surprised everyone. Even Emily. A letter? Yes. Thomas nodded. Written at the end. After everything else was finished. Holloway's eyes widened. Decades of research had never suggested that possibility. Entire academic papers had been built upon assumptions that suddenly seemed fragile. To whom? Thomas looked at him. To the people who would come after us. No one spoke. Thomas continued. His voice remained calm, measured. The journal recorded what happened. The letter explained why it mattered. Emily felt a chill move through her. The distinction was profound. Historians had spent years studying events. Yet perhaps the missing page had never been about events at all. Perhaps it had been about meaning. Holloway looked almost overwhelmed. And you kept it all this time? I promised I would. The curator's gaze drifted toward the exhibit surrounding them. Every display case, every photograph, every artifact. The museum had spent decades telling a story assembled from fragments. Yet the most important piece had been sitting in a drawer somewhere, protected by a man who never asked for recognition. Ethan Brooks felt a growing sense of embarrassment. He remembered approaching Thomas only an hour earlier. He remembered asking him to move along, asking him to leave. The memory felt heavier now. Holloway carefully unfolded the document one final time. His eyes scanned the faded handwriting. Then something caught his attention, a detail so small that nobody else noticed it. The curator's expression changed again. Emily immediately saw it. What is it? She asked. Holloway did not answer. Instead, he turned the paper toward the light. Near the bottom margin, beneath the signature everyone had focused on, was another line. Faint, nearly invisible, hidden by age. The curator's hand trembled slightly. This cannot be. Thomas looked at him calmly. You found it. Holloway lifted his eyes. The missing page was never the final page. The crowd stood frozen. Emily felt her heart pound. What do you mean? The curator looked from the document to Thomas Whitaker. Then he spoke the words that changed everything. There was another page after this one. And according to this note, only one person ever knew where it was hidden. Every eye in the gallery turned toward Thomas. The gallery stood completely still. No footsteps, no whispers, no movement. Every person in the room was looking at Thomas Whitaker, the old man who had arrived unnoticed, the old man who had been asked to move along, the old man who now carried the answer to a mystery that had survived for more than 4 decades. Dr. Richard Holloway carefully lowered the document. The faint note hidden near the bottom remained visible beneath the bright museum lights. Only one person ever knew where it was hidden, he repeated quietly. And according to this, that person was you. Thomas looked at the curator. Then he looked around the gallery. Visitors stood shoulder to shoulder. Museum employees had quietly gathered near the exhibit. Even Ethan Brooks seemed frozen in place. The old man took a slow breath. Not exactly. Holloway frowned. What do you mean? Thomas's eyes drifted toward the photograph one last time. Toward the young faces captured in a moment long before history decided they mattered. I knew where it was hidden, he said. But I was never supposed to keep it forever. Emily Carter stepped forward. Then why did you? Thomas was silent for a moment. The answer appeared to come from somewhere very far away. Because the man who gave it to me asked me to wait. Holloway stared at him. Wait for what? A faint smile touched the old man's face. For the right people to care. The words settled heavily over the room. Nobody laughed. Nobody questioned him. The curator looked down at the exhibit surrounding them. The journal. The photographs. The carefully researched displays. Decades of work devoted to preserving a story. Yet suddenly it seemed that history had been waiting too. Waiting for the final witness to walk through the front door. Holloway straightened slowly. Then he did something nobody expected. He turned toward the gathered visitors. Ladies and gentlemen, he said, his voice carrying across the silent gallery. Today we learned something extraordinary. Every eye remained fixed on him. We believe this exhibit was complete. He glanced toward Thomas. It was not. The curator stepped aside and gestured toward the old man. The individual standing before you is not merely connected to this history. His voice softened. He is part of it. No applause followed. No dramatic reaction. Something far more powerful filled the room instead. Respect. Pure and unmistakable. Visitors who had never met Thomas Whitaker stood silently as the weight of that realization settled over them. Ethan lowered his eyes. The memory of their first conversation replayed in his mind. He wished he could take it back. Thomas noticed. He offered the younger man a small nod. Not judgment. Not anger. Just understanding. Holloway carefully handed the document back to its owner. His movements carried the same respect normally reserved for priceless artifacts. Mr. Whitaker, he said quietly, would you allow us to hear the rest of the story? Thomas looked down at the paper resting in his hands. The same paper he had protected for 43 years. The same paper that had quietly outlived assumptions, theories, and forgotten records. Then he looked toward the photograph, toward the faces of friends long gone. His expression softened. Yes, he said, I think it is finally time. Sunlight streamed through the glass walls of the museum, illuminating the exhibit in warm gold. For a brief moment, past and present seemed to stand together beneath the same light. And as Thomas Whitaker prepared to reveal the final chapter that history had never heard, everyone in the gallery understood a simple truth. Some names never asked to be remembered. Yet somehow, history remembers them anyway.